session is terrifying. Out of all of the topics that I've had the pleasure of presenting on at conferences over the years, this is likely the most intimidating. Just wanted to get that off my chest. The topic is so important, I need to do it justice. So I've worked to boil down my thoughts over the last decade of working in the space into 6 points to better understand inclusion and diversity, how we can work to design and implement more effective strategies in our companies. So in this session, we're going to talk about why it's more important than ever, the one reason why it most often fails, how we can think differently about our people, the role of empathy and successful inclusion and diversity at work, and the link between inclusion and diversity and engagement. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with 4 steps to driving greater impact with inclusion and diversity. Before we jump in, I do have some housekeeping items. Wanted to thank you for joining me as a part of this 4th annual Perceptyx Innovation Conference. I'm Brad Wilson, part of the professional services team here. And I've been a part of the Perceptyx family for over 9 years now. And in that time, I've had the pleasure of partnering with many of the world's top companies. In my early days, I even remember reading case studies as a part of my MBA program on inclusion and diversity, and many of the companies featured were clients of mine that I was working with at the time. So it's been very interesting to see this work evolve and to be able to be a part of that changing narrative in the space of inclusion and diversity. I do miss the days of live conferences and events, and I look forward to being able to be with many of you again in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. If you do have questions during this session, there is a Q&A feature available. I've also chose to do this live in true Perceptyx fashion. So at the end, I do hope to have some time for Q&A. You can also always connect with me on LinkedIn or email me directly, bwilson@perceptyx.com, and I will get back to you as quickly as I'm able. So let's jump in. First of all, this work is as important or more important than ever. It's 2020. It's been a crazy year. We've got civil unrest. We've seen that COVID-19 has had a disproportionately negative impact on women in the workplace. I just saw a statistic last week that 60% of people that have been laid off have been women, and that is because of a higher representation in retail and hospitality industries, so it's having an impact there. But even women that have kept their jobs have also had a greater negative impact with schools being closed and work-life balance and a lot of those challenges. We also see there's an increased awareness and interest, so consumers are paying attention. And those are just a few of the reasons why it is so important and even more important than it was a few years ago. Organizations care about this, consumers care about this, and there are some common mistakes that I've seen made with many of the organizations that limit the positive impact of well-intended initiatives. Inclusion and diversity is about unlocking potential, leading to better decisions, more effective innovation, and we see in business that change is the new constant. So as if the outside pressures weren't enough to prioritize this, there's also a lot of organizational changes that are impacting inclusion and diversity that are pushing this to the forefront now, and it's getting more time and attention at the executive level. We see the rate of change and innovation, the need for improved decision-making, and also employee experiences. All of these things are creating an even greater impact and prioritization on the work. To be effective, we need to prioritize this work differently. Got a quote here: if everyone is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. I had a stakeholder interview a few weeks ago with a client CFO. She's been with the organization about a year, and she talked about how her personality style doesn't necessarily match that of the broader leadership team, and she didn't feel comfortable speaking up in certain situations based on the way that the broader executive team operates. And that's exactly what we're looking for at the core of inclusion and diversity. It's not enough to increase representation. The culture and the ability to speak up and actually make an impact, that's really what this work is all about. And if you've got a team of 10 people and there's no disagreement in a meeting between those 10 people, that means 9 of those people were irrelevant. They didn't add any value because they didn't share any unique perspectives, questions, or ideas. So we want to encourage that at the organizational level. But in order to do that, we need to understand why I&D efforts, as well-intended as they are, often fail. And I'll say it's because of one word, and that is oversimplification. First, we oversimplify the very concept of inclusion and diversity when we talk about it as though it's one thing. Inclusion is about culture and experience. Diversity is about representation. I've worked with a lot of organizations that are very inclusive, but they're not diverse. I've also worked with a lot of organizations that are very diverse, but they're not inclusive. They may default to the hippo idea, the highest paid person's opinion, and everybody defaults to looking at that one individual. If that's the case, if that's the environment, then the organization is not going to benefit from the diversity of experiences and backgrounds and people that are sitting around the table. Increasing diversity in and of itself does not increase effectiveness if the culture doesn't support a free flow of ideas. From a survey perspective, we actually ask about involvement, belonging, experience, and inclusion. That matters to everyone in an organization. Then we use demographic data, either preloaded or self-reported, so that you can compare experiences across groups. And then we also leverage the Perceptyx comment analytics tools to understand culture and experience. But the reality is inclusion and diversity need to be treated as two separate issues in order for us to be effective. When we lump it together and assume that greater diversity equals greater inclusion, we set ourselves up for failure. We also oversimplify the approach. Recruitment and selection are critical, and companies are making strides. We're seeing it in improving processes to minimize negative impact of bias in the selection process. But we can't stop there. It's only the beginning. If we only focus on selection, we run the risk of creating a revolving door for diverse talent. And we do see that companies are making strides to improve their selection processes and minimize the negative impact of bias in the process. However, we can't stop there. So we did a project a few years ago with a PR marketing firm that focused on very much on diversity of personality and ideas. And they used Myers-Briggs within the organization and loaded that as a preloaded demographic. And they were surprised to see that the least represented quadrant in those 16 types came from the creative side, or the personality types that are traditionally seen as the creatives. And what we actually found a year later was not only was that the least represented group, but voluntary attrition from that group was 3 times higher than any of the other 4 quadrants in that model. So it wasn't just about selection and recruitment, but their culture and the way that they worked made it difficult for those people to thrive and anticipate success and really engage on the job. And so they had a much higher voluntary attrition rate from that group. So again, this is not just about the traditional measures of diversity in terms of ethnicity, gender, and age. We can look at it from other areas to understand what are the organizational impacts that we're trying to have so that we can select, recruit, and also retain that talent to maximize the positive impact that this work has. We also oversimplify the concept of identity. It can be not only ineffective, but actually insulting to boil people down to a single dimension of their identity and their differences. We're going to talk more about this on the next slide. But people are complex. And the reality is there are certain attributes to our identity that are consistent and relevant for everybody in the workplace. And then there are things that have the potential to divide us. And so the question becomes, how do we engage and retain people with differences and also create that sense of belonging without asking people to check their identities and their differences at the door? How do we embrace that for positive change within the organization? And so we're going to talk more about identity on the next slide. Also, for research design, quantitative statistics will fall short in this area. Real inclusion and diversity relies on understanding the lived experience and the stories that people have. And we do not get the level of specificity and detail when we're only looking at things like averages and statistical measures or the relationship between variables in a survey. That's a great place to start, and it's an opportunity for us to identify pockets of an organization where maybe there are certain manager behaviors that may be getting in the way of certain groups feeling included and feeling that sense of belonging. But to really be effective in this work, we need to embrace qualitative research and that approach to understanding the employee experience. And I would also say that we need to avoid univariate analysis when it comes to I&D work. Univariate analysis is when we only look at things by one dimension. So an example of this would be doing a straight comparative analysis between men and women within an organization. A few years ago, at the height of the Me Too movement, we saw multiple clients making headlines for all the wrong reasons. And with that fresh in our minds, a research consultant went into a client's data, looked at a comparison between men and women, and looked at the trends, and we saw the men saw consistent and improving scores, and the women saw significant declines in the data, a lot of red, and the biggest declines were things about feeling valued, organizational trust, being treated with respect. So immediately the research consultant came to me and said, I think we've got a real problem here in this organization. And it looked like it was going to be potentially another Me Too headline story. The reality was, though, that organization was going through a major restructuring, and the way their employees were distributed across groups, they had a much higher frequency of women in one segment of the business, and they had more men in another part of the business. And there were rumors about the segment with a higher frequency of women or higher representation of women being subcontracted out to the organization. And that function essentially going away was the concern. And so the reality was, when we looked at this by function and gender, it was a functional issue. It was an organizational issue more than it was just a gender issue. I would also say there's a lot of times, if you look at men versus women within a business, you may not see significant differences, but if we're trying to increase gender diversity in leadership, if we look at job level and gender, that's where we start to see some significant differences. Or if we look at job level and ethnicity within the United States, that's actually where we see the lived experiences really come through, and there are some significant differences. So I would encourage you, with the Perceptix platform, engage in a more complex view of the data to really understand and tell that story. Finally, application. As we go through, inclusion and diversity doesn't necessitate design by committee. So some organizations, they want to be more inclusive. And so in their mind, that means just pulling more seats up to the table when decisions are being made or work is being done. The truth is, if you are familiar with Victor Vroom's model for decision making, there are situations where the best outcome is going to come from a leader making a decision and not necessarily involving other people. If they have the information they need, if team buy-in is not as important, if speed is a priority, that works in those situations. And unfortunately, some organizations will pivot so far to the other side that everything becomes designed by committee, and it has a significant negative impact on innovation and decision quality, because we go around and around. I've seen organizations where we've had 40, 50 people involved in designing an employee survey. And what that can actually be evidence of is a fear culture where nobody wants to be the person that has the authority to make the decision and move something forward. And it's kind of done sometimes in the spirit of inclusion, but the actual impact that it has actually the opposite impact on the work. Also, oversimplification of execution. It cannot be one size fits all, and it cannot only be top down. So there's significant value that enterprise level initiatives have, especially around funding and resourcing things like employee resource groups. But belonging and inclusion happens at the local level, and that's where the relationship becomes so important between managers and their people to really help understand and unlock the potential of individuals. So it can't be one size fits all, and it does have to happen within the relationship. And then finally, the last one we're going to talk about here is the value proposition. Inclusion and diversity initiatives do not only benefit employees who are members of underrepresented groups. This is something that has an impact on organizational effectiveness, and it creates opportunity across the board. And I think this is one of the areas that is so important to understand, because unfortunately, sometimes these initiatives are delegated to an individual where that's their focus. And the perception or the risk is it creates the perception that there's the business and then there's this initiative, and they cannot be separate. I had a similar situation with a technology company a number of years ago. At the end of the executive presentation, the chief operating officer turned to the CEO and asked, he said, "Do you want me to focus on employee engagement or business results? Because I don't have time for both." And I'm glad he asked that question, but it hurt to hear it because it spoke to a much deeper issue. And unfortunately, there are people that will think the same thing about inclusion and diversity initiatives. They will ask, "Do you want me to focus on inclusion and diversity, or do you want me to focus on business results because I don't have time for both?" And they're not separate issues. So when it comes to understanding the value proposition, we have to create alignment between this work and the other things that people care about in the business, because the reality is, again, it's about unlocking potential for individuals, for teams, and for the broader business. So we have to position the value differently. And so I would say, to summarize this, with oversimplification, we need to think about this work differently. And we'll get into, again, some of the next steps as we think about this. So on the idea of identity, we oversimplify the concept of identity. And this model that I'm going to share actually comes from, if you guys took gen eds as an undergrad, 99% of them were useless. I took a sociology 101 class, first semester, freshman year. There were like 400 people packed in a lecture hall. But it hit me about a month ago that what we talked about 18 years ago is absolutely relevant to this conversation. So there are horizontal lines. There are certain things, certain factors that are consistent to the human experience. They unite all of us. If anybody's read Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi, he talks about health, wealth, and family. And that book is about networking and building relationships. And so basically, if you can benefit someone's health, wealth, their children or their family, that's an easy in, because it's such a universal value. Daniel Pink in Drive talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. One of our co-founders, Jack Morehouse, talks about achievement, affiliation, affluence, and autonomy. If you look at hierarchy of needs, if you look at the two-factor motivator hygiene theory from Hertzberg, all of these things talk about these universal basics that are true for all of us. Relationships, respect, psychological safety, the anticipation of success, these are things that matter to all of us, regardless of differences, and those are factors that unite us. But there are also things that have the potential to divide us. So examples here would be our gender, group affiliation, ethnicity, parental status, personality profiles, the way that we think and act, StrengthsFinder. These are all things that actually create the uniqueness that is in each of us. And while they have the potential to divide us, our strongest sense of belonging actually exists with people that are in our in-group, or that we perceive to be in our in-group, along some of these vertical lines. And so the challenge is, how do we create inclusive cultures that respect individuals, where we don't ask them to check their identity and their experience at the door, but we also enable them to connect at a deeper level, because everybody wants to be part of something bigger than themselves. We all want to be, this gets to the idea of affiliation, we all want to contribute. And so our experiences and our identities are made up along both these horizontal and these vertical axes. The third axis that I'm adding here is the y-axis, and that's time. And sometimes this is an easy one to forget. But we also, our identities and the way that we make sense of our own lived experiences will change over time. An example of this, if you think back to when you were in school, if you were a member of a sports team or Greek life, those are things that may have been a big part of your identity at one point that are no longer a central part of your identity. It's still part of your lived experience, and it will still shape your perspective on the world. But it's not going to be as central as it was at one time. Other relationship statuses may be really, really important to you at one point, and they become less important over time. And I think we need to acknowledge and respect that about individuals, that we have the ability to change and our identities will evolve. But we can't limit people to one dimension of difference. And so for this work to be successful, we need to see people differently. We need to understand that there are those universal factors that are consistent for all of us, but then there are also those things that have the potential to divide us. And we can respect those differences and be respectful of those differences, so we can create a sense of belonging without asking people to check those differences at the door. One of the big ones that we're seeing come through in survey data this year is parental status. And I have a client that is trying to increase the sense of inclusion and belonging for their female staff, their workers, and they're almost exactly 50-50 between men and women. However, what they're finding is that a lot of the women in the workplace are really struggling with stress and work-life balance. And we've also done work with clients where we look at the gender balance and gender dynamic in the employee-manager relationship. And the hypothesis was that women who work and report to other women would feel a greater sense of belonging. But the variable that actually has a bigger impact than gender is parental status. And so when you have a working mom, a professional mom, and these are all professional employees in this organization, but when you have someone who has that responsibility and that role outside of work, and they're reporting to a female manager who is not a parent herself, that has created a barrier within this organization that makes it difficult for the manager to empathize and identify with some of those challenges. And so again, there's that opportunity to understand there are certain things that they have in common, but there are also some important differences. And that's where empathy becomes so important. Empathy is the ability to understand and identify someone else's experience, even if it's not our own, and still prioritize and value it and lead in accordance with that. So I would say, one, when we look at this, things like being encouraged to share our ideas, feeling comfortable discussing concerns with our manager, being treated with respect. These are things that are universal to the human experience and universal to the employee experience. And we need to make sure that that's core to our culture, regardless of inclusion and diversity initiatives. But we also see in the data that there are certain groups that are struggling more than others, especially in 2020. Another client, looking at their data by job level and gender, they find, and they are a predominantly female organization, they're almost 60 to 70% female. If we just do a straight comparison, there's a lot of lower level female employees that are not struggling with stress and work-life balance. But at the manager and senior manager level, all of a sudden there's this massive split between men and women in how they're responding in 2020. So again, we need to understand the whole employee, because when you think about, work-life balance, and now with so many people working remote and with many schools around the country being closed, the dynamic and challenges are so much greater than they were a year ago. And we have the ability not only to focus on one dimension of difference, but actually take this three-dimensional approach to employees and really understand what it is that makes up their actual experience. The next point I would say is successful inclusion and diversity requires empathy, involvement, and belonging. There's a model that was created at Perceptyx over a decade ago, and it's ask, listen, respond, involve, and solve. Sometimes we have a tendency and a temptation to take survey data, go behind a closed door, diagnose an issue, and solve it just among a small group of people, even on complex issues like inclusion and diversity. But the reality is, to be effective in this work, we have to involve people, and inclusion and diversity cannot be something that we do to anybody. Accessibility is also something that is so central and will become more important in the I&D space. We work with Apple, and they have an incredible focus on accessibility for not only consumers, but also their employees. And they've pushed Perceptyx on the issue of accessibility. And there are things that we weren't aware of in our technology. But the great thing is, now that we're aware of that and we've been able to address those issues in our technology, that work will benefit all of our other clients. There are certain things that are so easy to be unaware of because they don't affect us. Another example would be, I remember a client a number of years ago had one of their top executives was red-green colorblind, which I'm finding is a very, very common situation, especially among men. And if you're not red-green colorblind, you would never give it another thought. But we were using certain icons in the executive presentation that relied on someone to be able to tell the difference between those two colors to make sense of the data and the information. And so for that client, and now for other clients, we're able to design and implement things that look for those differences. I saw a documentary about 10 years ago called Objectified, and the focus was on industrial design. But one of the companies that they profiled is OXO. They're the company, they make a lot of like kitchen tools with these big, massive handles. And I remember them talking about designing for people with arthritis, because if they design tools that work for people with arthritis, it benefits everybody that uses those tools. So again, going back to the difference between quantitative and qualitative analysis, if we're only looking at quantitative studies, we ignore the outlier. We may look for averages and we manage to the average, but when it comes to the employee experience, we have the opportunity to embrace the outlier, embrace someone that has a different experience, a different perspective. And if we manage and design people practices to benefit that individual, you can know that the benefits will come across the board, but you don't get to that if you're only looking at the largest groups within an organization. And this work happens within the context of relationship. There's actually a quote that I saw this morning from Harvard Business Review, and it's perfect for this, but it says, when people feel like they belong at work, they're 3.5 times more likely to contribute their fullest potential. So there's work that we can do from the top down, from an enterprise perspective. But when it talks about belonging, that happens in the context of relationship, and that's incredibly personal and specific to the employee and the manager. And getting to this idea of contributing their full potential, this work is engaging. And this session is not about employee engagement, but I'm going to talk about this very, very quickly here. This is a model that we've used for a number of years at Perceptyx. Internal and external factors have an impact on how engaged employees are. We pursue engagement because it's linked to higher retention and performance through the application of discretionary effort. When you create your a situation where you're able to retain your best people, enable them to do great work, that increases the likelihood of success or progress, both for the individual and the organization. Inclusion and diversity is engaging because it's about unlocking potential, and that requires creation of the anticipation of success. Gina Cox is a senior consultant and executive coach at Perceptic. She had a session yesterday talking about the retention of diverse talent and specific needs that employees have that we've uncovered this year through different projects that we've done. If you missed her session, I would strongly encourage you to go back and watch a recording of it. But at its core, inclusion and diversity, again, is about unlocking potential and building that anticipation of success. It is engaging. And the landscape has changed a bit. A lot of the topics that in conversations we had a year ago were about how do we retain diverse talent. I've had multiple technology clients that are trying to increase gender diversity among their leadership levels. We also have clients that are focusing on increasing ethnic diversity within the US among their leaders. And that's where retention and recruitment are important to get the talent in the pipeline. But if we're not able to engage and retain those people, we're going to have limited long-term benefits, because that talent that we invest in developing will leave for other organizations if we're not engaging them at the personal level. So again, this is true for all employees, but we also have an obligation and an opportunity to focus on those groups that are not naturally engaging and not naturally being brought into that positive kind of flow of culture and engagement within our organizations. So in order for us to do this, again, we need to link inclusion and diversity and engagement and understand the connection in those different strategies. I have a client just last week, I met with their executive team. They have a question. So this is I think a phenomenal survey question. And it is: the support provided by my manager helps me unlock my potential at work. That came up as one of their engagement drivers. And it served as a segue into the topic of inclusion and diversity within this organization. But it also begs the question, what does it look like for a manager to provide support that helps me unlock my potential at work? So we did a driver analysis on that specific item. And it came down to: my manager plays an active role in supporting my success. My manager supports my skill and career development. My manager openly acknowledges and promotes my contributions. My manager gives me regular feedback on performance, and leaders respect and value differences of opinions within this organization. That is the blueprint for unlocking potential, engaging people. And then when we look across the organization, we can say, okay, is this consistent and happening for everybody by job level, by gender, by ethnicity? And if not, how can we lean in and provide that necessary support to build the anticipation of success for those people? So getting into how to set our organizations up for success in the I&D space. Number one, we need to model the desired behaviors at the top. Inclusion and diversity, focus, communication, investment in this area is a representation of core values. And there's plenty of research out there that shows that values, especially CEO and leader values, shape corporate culture. And corporate culture determines organizational outcomes. And if you think about this in the context of the competing values framework, we may think about inclusion and diversity really being more of that collaborative culture, the caring culture, the nurturing culture. But there's an opportunity to position inclusion and diversity as being necessary for innovative cultures, for organizations that really want to challenge the status quo. Because if we only select and retain people that have a specific experience and point of view, that's naturally going to create blinders. And we're not going to see, we're going to have so many blind spots and things that we don't know or questions we don't know to ask, that we're going to ultimately limit our ability to create a long-term competitive, sustainable advantage. The second one is empower and equip managers and understand that business is personal. So top-down initiatives are great, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the exchange between employees and their managers, and we need to get them specifically involved in the process. because that relationship is so critical to understand the individual, understand their unique perspectives and experiences. We don't want to boil them down to and then act as though all women have one experience or all of our Black and African American employees have one lived experience. That's just wrong on multiple levels. But it's in the context of that unique relationship that we can actually get to know our people and provide the necessary support so that they can anticipate their desired measure of success within an organization. The third part is support, develop, and engage the whole person. There are organizations that have made significant strides in increasing diversity, but if they're not creating that open, inclusive culture, or if they're still requiring people to work in a situation or a specific way that other life challenges pull them away, then ultimately we're either asking people to check their identity and unique experience at the door, or we're setting ourselves up for significant increased voluntary attrition from the very groups that have the potential to share real value and difference in the organization. And then the fourth thing is align this work with strategic initiatives and the desired business outcomes. It goes back to that question of, do you want me to focus on engagement or business results? Or the question of, do you want me to focus on inclusion and diversity or business results? This is not an either or situation, it's a both and. To succeed, I&D work cannot be viewed and treated as secondary priority to something that is anything less than critical to business success. We also cannot fuel, or I should say, the opportunity is to fuel corporate conversations around effective I&D using strategic survey data, but also understand that those conversations are not the end, they're just the beginning. So when it comes to taking quantitative data and looking across groups and understanding the lived experiences, that will show trends over time. We can look at trends, we can look at similarities, we can look at differences, but at the end of the day, we need to ask, listen, respond, involve people in solutions, and take a proactive approach to solving their unique challenges that they're facing. While we've all been impacted by the challenges of 2020, we do see that the impact on employees is different. It's not impacting everybody the same way, and that makes supporting the whole person more important than ever. Well-intended work can lead to disappointing results if, one, we make those mistakes, we fall into those traps of oversimplification, and there were 8 points on that in terms of oversimplification, but there's a lot of ways that we can oversimplify this. We also need to prioritize the work differently. We need to think about not only the work, but also people differently. We need to see our people differently, and we need to understand that every employee needs to know that they're valued and trusted within the organization. That is a universal issue. And trust happens in the context of relationships. And that relationship is necessary for us to have empathy and understand our people in a way that we can really engage them. So what some may see as a big challenge, I think there's a huge opportunity. And I think we are at an inflection point with this work. It's something that's been kind of behind the scenes for a lot of clients. And now we've got the opportunity to bring it to the forefront, not only to address the specific challenges of 2020, but also set ourselves and our organizations up for success long term. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with you and look forward to engaging in conversation.